thing that really made the biggest impression on me actually was the fact that it was warm. It was like welcoming. Like, and I remember as a kid, I always got the impression, I don't know about Switzerland, but in America, the schools are really dystopian looking, right? They're actually, many of them are actually designed by the same people who design prisons, like architects, right? So they tend to be dark. They are really, it's all about keeping people inside, keeping everyone safe and accounted for and stuff.
Yeah.
And so they tend to be just dark and depressing. I remember always feeling that as a kid. I felt like it was just, but it felt cold and institutional. Yeah, well, I grew up here in New Jersey, and I guess I like reading and talking about ideas with people. It's how I kind of stumbled upon Sudbury. A friend of mine, while I was living in Japan, I guess figured I would be interested in this sort of thing. He said he happened to be volunteering, and this friend of mine spoke fluent Japanese and stuff. So he happened to be volunteering at the Tokyo Sudbury School. And I had no idea what a Sudbury School was, like most people.
Cool.
But
yeah.
I was very curious about it. So he invited me to tag along. And in fact, when we got there, they had to basically have a vote on whether or not I'm allowed to visit for the day. Because it wasn't something that he, I guess, asked them about ahead of time or whatever.
Oh, wow. So you were all the way to Japan by the time you figured that out. Yeah, okay.
Oh, yeah. So I'd never been interested in teaching or anything like that because my experiences in school myself were so negative.
Right. Okay.
Going through public school systems the entire way and then to college and stuff. And I don't have any particular horror stories. I was just consistently unhappy. And I really didn't have any respect for most of the adults around, especially for whatever reason, I've always been very sensitive to this sort of pompous, condescending attitude that a lot of American adults have, especially like parent, teacher, student wise, but also parents can be this way too. It always rubbed me the wrong way. I could always tell when some adult was trying to like dumb something down to explain it to me. It always, just aggravated me. And that's basically all public school is, right? It's just like going at the slowest pace so everyone can follow along, and you have no choice in the topics or anything like that. So I had no interest in becoming part of anything like that. So I went to college near the Jersey Shore, Stockton University, and for economics, and then which I found extremely interesting. I was like very engaged with my professors and everything like that. And then I went and did nothing related to economics at all. And I just traveled abroad with some friends. We went to China and became English teachers there. So that's how I got into education and started making observations because of the sort of weird situation that I was in employment-wise in China, because most people who go there teach English do it through big organizations that bring them over, or they get a job with some corporation that usually offers to like house them and basically like take care of them so they can have sort of a expat experience abroad. But a couple of my friends had tried that who had been in China for a little while before I got there, and they reported really negative experiences. Oftentimes places like that will try to exploit them, exploit the workers, like exploit the fact that they can't speak Chinese or don't know any of the laws or whatever, and try to entrap them in these really low quality apartments, and then like, put clauses in the contract like, oh, well, you have to finish the first year before you're allowed to move, or we're going to like dock your pay, or, just really shady stuff like that. So luckily I had the experience of my friends going into it, so I didn't do any of that. And I basically started out just freelancing because the market for English is so good in China in particular that you could just do that. So I didn't even have an employer or anything like that. And I was making pretty high hourly rates.
Did you go to China expecting to do that job? Was that the plan? Or okay.
I didn't have a time frame or anything. It was more just like a what's it called, like a gap year sort of thing, only after college, right? I wanted to like decompress after all the years of schooling and whatever. I'm not certain that going to China was the best way to do that, but it did turn into an adventure, so it was worth it. And, you make good money doing that, especially the way I was doing it. And there's just infinite work doing that. And it's easy. It's like anyone who's fluent in English can do that. So especially if they definitely prefer, the Chinese rank people, basically. And so, like, if you're an English teacher from particular places, they prefer you more than if you were from other places. And so I happen to be from one of the places they think is real English, or whatever they want to, however they conceive of it. So that made it easier for me. But because I was doing classroom stuff, I was doing a lot of private tutoring. I was essentially teaching all ages in all these different little scenarios.
With absolutely no preparation whatsoever.
Yeah,
never done anything like it.
Yeah, I was stunned that most of the Chinese agents who would connect me with people, sometimes I would run into people myself, but most of the time it was like through these like middlemen sort of thing. And I was astounded at how little they seemed to care about how prepared I was or how prepared they were. Like, they had like no information about any of their clients that they gave me beforehand, even when I asked for it, except for like, oh, they have 2 kids and they want their kids to learn English. And I'm like, okay, do they know anything? Do they want me to work with a book or anything like that? They just never. So I just basically came up with my own little routine as like an introductory lesson that tended to work with everybody, like sort of a one-size-fits-all thing, so then I could go from there. But essentially it gave me a good opportunity to observe different people with different motives. So like the people who were learning English and coming to my class or getting tutored by me, and they actually wanted to, like, organically, like not because they're just trying to pad the resume, or not because they just want to get like a visa level of English so they can get to the United States or something. The people who actually were motivated and actually were interested in the topic were the people who were the best students, who learned the English rapidly, and the ones who weren't, which typically was children whose parents were making them do this, just didn't learn at all. It didn't really matter what happened in the class. And I would try to, after a certain point of comfort, I got to a point where I tried to actually explain that to parents a little bit. It just did not work at all. They were just like, oh, the kids aren't learning. Well, have you tried giving them more homework? And I'm like, wait a minute, I don't think you understand my point. There's no, so that was really the thing. It was actually quite sad after a while.
Wait. So what about your Chinese? I mean, you could speak Chinese, or how did this work?
No, oftentimes the middleman would speak good enough English to translate when necessary, or sometimes, because this was Beijing where I was living and working, sometimes the parents would speak enough conversational English so that I could talk to them a little bit about stuff like this. But there's no concept of real, like, it was just like almost like more schoolwork, more homework equals more learning.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's just like, the kids aren't learning, so you
not
just
too uncommon, I'd say, still here. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it was really different from America, where homework is like, it's sort of not seen as like an inherent good, as it seems to be in China. And I've heard anecdotal reports that it's similar in India as well, though I've never been there. But just hyper focused on the academics, right?
Sure. I just thought that was kind of a standard thing in Western society as well, that homework is generally seen as something important and good, and kids teach. Parents are here to tell the kids to do homework. I mean, for me, that's a normal thing. I mean, that's how I grew up. Maybe I didn't have as much as the Chinese do. I probably not. I don't know, but it was a very normal thing for me growing up, that homework was a good thing and it's part of school, and teachers, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was a thing for me growing up too, but there definitely seems to have been like a shift here in the States on that, because there's a lot more awareness on like, oh, well, these how much of this homework is actually being done by the students, if it's not if it's like parents doing homework for them, because we have a huge problem with helicopter parenting here.
Yeah.
To the extent that they'll like do things for the kids and like hand in projects that are clearly done by parents and not by the kids.
Yeah.
And so people start asking questions about like, oh, is this just like privileging the already privileged students who have parents who have enough time to hold their hand through all this homework? And so that conversation's in the air. And certainly I don't want to give the impression that all Americans are anti-homework, but I think relative to other places, there seems to be less of a focus or less of a belief in its efficacy here. I mean, there have actually been studies in the efficacy of homework, and it's all basically the only, if I remember correctly, the only situation in which homework was found to be effective at all was in assigning math homework to teenagers. Every other group of kids and every other subject, there was found to be no benefit to homework on the kids' academic progress, if that's all you care about, right? That's not even addressing the sort of emotional, demerits of taking up even more of the kids' time, right? Which is another thing I noticed in China, which was really starting to bum me out, and is one of the reasons I ultimately moved to Japan. Was that a lot of these kids, some of the kids actually who had been sort of forced to take English classes for a long time, who could kind of have conversations with me, would often choose to practice their English by basically telling me how sad they were because all they want to do is play video game. I forget what it was at the time. There's Minecraft or something. There's one thing they all like to talk about. But all they want to do is play video games and do all these things that kids like to do. But they tell me, oh no, well I have to go. Yeah. So I say tell me about your schedule. What's your day like? And they'll say, well, from this time to this time I go to school. And then after that I have violin class. And after that I have English class. And then after that I have to do my homework for an hour. And then there's dinner. And then after that, every other Saturday I have 30 minutes to play the game I want to play. Right. And this is very consistent. I understand, like, I'm getting probably a selection of people from the upper crust of like Beijing life. So I'm not saying this applies to all Chinese people, but from what I understand, the Chinese culture is very heavy into, sort of academics, work the kids, make them jump through hoops until they're ready to basically get married and have a career, basically.
Sure. I know very little about China. I always find it hard to get information I actually trust, but I did see this report recently of them putting cameras into the classroom, and that was kind of a widespread thing. I think it wasn't just like one school. I think it was like a policy thing.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised at all.
They were interviewing kids.
There's no sense of privacy in terms of cameras shouldn't be.
I think the idea was to kind of monitor automatically with AI if they're paying attention or not. I think that was the general idea. It's just incredible.
Right. But you actually remind me, and this is really interesting. In light of what I just said about homework. So apparently that issue of homework got to be such a problem in China in terms of the kids becoming depressed that the actual CCP, the central government of China, actually started forcing the schools to give less homework. But this didn't work to address the depression, actually. It's kind of remarkable. You really don't see a whole lot of attention in China paid to mental health and stuff like that. But it didn't work because the parents turned around and basically, they're sending them to the public school, local school or whatever, and they're getting less homework. The parents' response to that is to then enroll their kids in a secondary, cram school. In Japan, they call them cram schools. I don't know what the word is in Chinese or Mandarin, but essentially it just failed because these little private schools, probably similar to ones I work for English, were just satisfying this demand from the parents to get more homework. So it's a very culturally ingrained thing. It's not even necessarily the government is down with at this point, because you have these kids who are just crushed and debilitated by the time they're teenagers because you haven't allowed them to have a second of their lives where they can actually do things. So, I mean, that's a problem here in America too, but in China, it's just a whole another level of, work your kids so they can become the sort of ideal that you're supposed to, so you can be the ideal parent, right? You're seen as the the most responsible parent. Your kid knows how to play violin. Your kid has gotten into the best school. Your kid can speak English or whatever. All these things are very important, almost like to keep up with the Joneses type of way. I know we have that phrase in America where it's like, we just want to sort of project our status, right? Like, look what we have, look at our nice house with the white picket fence, look how successful our kids are. It's very powerful.
Right. I mean, I've heard it also from a very clear fear standpoint. I mean, there's people in my family who've told me this about their own children and stuff, where it's like, they're really worried about the whole competition, the globalization competition, the Chinese competition, all these smart Chinese kids coming over and blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And the reaction, obviously all these things, it's not, not everybody sees it the same, but I just also got this impression that it might be a very widespread thing in the US that the competition is already high to get into colleges and all this kind of stuff. There's all these, hoops you got to go through. Maybe you get a scholarship here, maybe good in sports, however all that stuff works. And now you also have the global competition ramping up. And so you just want to stuff your kid's brain as fast as possible with as much as possible out of a fear of, having them miss out, not get the opportunities they need to, mm-hmm. have a comfortable life or whatever. I don't know. I've certainly heard that mindset. I've seen that mindset around in the US more than here. I just feel like in Switzerland, there's way less about those pressures, various pressures. There's less financial pressures for one, like the whole thing of how do you finance, your college? How do you get it? That's one big stress that kind of almost falls away here. But also we don't have as many international people in, like, for instance, in a conservatory, in the music, absolutely huge competition. Russians, and people from Asia and all over the place. Like the best people come to Europe to study music, so there's a huge competition there. But otherwise, like a normal university, anything kind of typical subjects, you're basically among Swiss people and maybe a few Germans. So it's not like we have this huge pressure of like the whole world's coming and competing with us, but anyway, I've just gotten that impression that people worry about that stuff.
So these are some of the observations I was having as I was a teacher, and then for some of those reasons, and then many other reasons, but mostly related to lifestyle and pollution. After about 2 years, I moved to Japan, which I traveled to and really kind of fell in love with. And then I basically started doing the same thing there, only Japan is more, Japan is more by the book, right? So there's no, I could have been a freelancer, I guess, but like, there's also not quite as big of a market for English in Japan. So I ended up getting a normal employment deal with an Eikaiwa, which is like an English school. Think of like a after school thing for kids or like an evening thing for adults. So I taught all ages there, and it was very fun. And I didn't have any of the sort of depressing moments that I had in China with the kids, but I did notice something really interesting. So in Japan, they treat younger kids, and maybe like age 10 and below, with a whole lot more trust and freedom than Americans do, in my experience. And this has been something I've actually independently heard other Americans remark on or agree with me on. Like you will see a little playground, a neighborhood playground with just little kids playing by themselves on it, which nowadays in America, you really don't see that. You will see, 6-year-olds riding the subway by themselves in Japan, which would be,
that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it would be almost scandalous in America at this point for that to happen. In fact, it was. And there was this, I can't remember her name, but she's prominent in you probably heard her before, but there's this mom who's prominent now in like the unschooling movement who let her son ride the New York subway and like gave him a map and a cell phone or something. And
sounds slightly familiar. Yeah.
This was like maybe like 5 years ago or so, but she was brought in the news and all the news anchors were like, but what if he had died? How would you have felt? And, so, but nothing happened to him, luckily. And it was a good little marketing, I guess, thing for the unschooling movement. But once you started getting into the middle school years for Japanese students, that seems like the culture really changes on them. All of a sudden now everything becomes about these exams that they have, right? So you have to get a good grade on the middle school exam so you can get into the best high school. You have to get a grade on the high school exams so you can get to the best college. And then everything flips over. And all of a sudden the Japanese parents, or maybe also including like educators and whatever, society at large becomes way more repressive and controlling on the kids, and kind of surpasses where American parents are, where they're a little bit more stable, I guess, where it's like they're less trusting of little kids and more helicoptery, but they don't really increase. If anything, they kind of decrease their helicopterness as the kids get into their teenage years. So that was interesting to me to notice that, and I saw it in my classroom, like once they started getting into middle school and stuff, and keep in mind, these are all kids who, generally speaking, wanted to be in the class. I didn't really have a whole lot of students in Japan who were like adamantly, like clearly being forced to be there the way I was pretty common in China. But still, like they had no energy. Like the little kids would be like super happy to come into class, and they'd be all curious, and they'd want to play and do the games and English songs or whatever. And the older the kids got, like they still wanted to learn. You could tell they were still trying to pay attention, but they were just really exhausted. And you ask them, how are you? How are you today? What did you do today? And they're just like, oh, I'm really tired. We had, X, Y, and Z. And, so that was kind of interesting. But all of these observations sort of were swirling in my mind when my friend showed me the Tokyo Sudbury School, which was pretty small at the time. I don't know what it is like now. But it was just in like a normal house on the outskirts of Tokyo. It was very, the thing that really made the biggest impression on me actually was the fact that it was warm. It was like welcoming. And I remember as a kid, I always got the impression, I don't know about Switzerland, but in America, the schools are really dystopian looking, right? Many of them are actually designed by the same people who design prisons, like architects, right? So they tend to be dark. They are really. It's all about keeping people inside, keeping everyone safe and accounted for and stuff.
Yeah. Sure.
And so they tend to be just dark and depressing. I remember always feeling that as a kid. I felt like it was just, but it felt cold and institutional.
I find most schools still, when I walk around Switzerland, even though some of the buildings are nice, like some of them are like 100 years old, 150 years old, they have a little, decorations on the wall and stuff like that. But still, I find most of them, just because of their size and the heaviness and the right angles and the structuredness and everything, there's hardly any place that I find warm, that feels warm to me.
Yeah, totally. And actually, you brought up a good point. The older schools here, like the school buildings that are still standing from like a century ago, usually these big brick buildings are actually better. They let in more light and stuff. But certainly the ones built in the past like 50, 60 years are really depressing. Right. But so that's my concept of school, and I'm now walking into a school for the first time since I've been to school, basically, to see this Sudbury School in Tokyo. Yeah. And we get there, and it's just a house, and all the people inside are happy, and they're warm and welcoming and stuff. And I'm just like, whoa, this is a school? How this doesn't make any sense? Yeah. So that's what spurred me to do all the research, learn about Sudbury, and learn about the laws here. I wasn't.
So you had how many years of this teaching English stuff? When
about 3.
About 3 years.
3. After 3 years after I got out of college.
Okay, so you did 3 years of basically most of the time you were teaching English.
Yeah, teaching English in between, sort of traveling around, and I traveled all around Japan and Thailand and stuff during this time as well. But I was financed that by teaching English. Yeah.
And you weren't like seriously questioning anything until you saw a completely different model. Is that correct? Like you were just doing the job, you're doing the best as you could. You kind of embraced the teacher role that, you only had so many possibilities, right? You had a really small space to work in, a specific time, a specific goal to, and you did the best, you made the best of it, but you weren't like questioning the system at that point until you were confronted with other completely different options, basically?
Well, no, I had definitely questioned the system, and I definitely didn't agree with schooling. I just didn't know that there were any really positive or holistic schooling models that existed. And maybe I had heard of Montessori or something, but even that didn't sound
well, until you see that stuff, I think it's hard to really figure out what it's about. I mean, even Montessori, I feel like it's such a famous name. So many people have a really superficial idea of what that's about. And then I had to actually, I mean, I've never actually been to a real Montessori schools. I hear they're very, diverse, like they're all a bit different. But just reading one entire kind of compendium book, I realized that this is quite amazing. I mean, I was like, I was really amazed. It was 100 years old, and she made a lot of observations that I was just like, recognized, like, oh wow, somebody else has thought this before. Like the societal implications, like the real hope for change for society through a completely different way to deal with babies and really small children and young children.
Oh yeah.
That whole idea is like, inspiring. Oh my God, okay, she thought of the whole thing. She was very, she thought big, and she was working as a doctor, and she was working specifically for childhood sickness, and then she was working for the psychology aspect, and kind of really one of the first ones to dive into that. But she was really thinking very big. I was really impressed. So yeah, it's amazing, because most people think of Montessori as, I don't know, wood blocks or something, like, one of those specific little, props that she built or that she made up for teaching. And some of those things made it into our normal school system. Like, we had some of those ideas in my elementary school. I realized recently that was a Montessori thing. But of course, the general ideas of hers were not at all taken. It was just, like these individual tiny little pieces. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting too, because that sort of brings up like, why weren't they? A lot of the issue with schooling, and this has become really, I mean, this is a segue into maybe more COVID stuff, but you're seeing here in America, the politics or the messaging around schooling is really interesting. It's becoming quite clear that schools aren't just for education, at least not in America, right?
Oh, yeah.
They are sort of a service for parents, so parents can live a particular lifestyle that the society wants them to adopt, right? But so that's not too controversial, like the research around teenagers' circadian rhythms, like, oh, it's actually not good for them to be waking up quite this early. If you just push the buses back an hour or so, this would be so beneficial for them. And then no school district in America does that because it's actually inconvenient for the parents because of their work schedules, right? So this less important thing, it takes precedence. But at the outset of COVID here in March, you saw some pretty interesting messaging from certain politicians in my part of the country with regard to schools, which might surprise you now, because right now in America, the Democratic Party is very much the party of safety and doing, all this virus awareness stuff and all that. But their actual initial reaction to all this in March vis-a-vis schools was really interesting, because they were instantly against any question of closing the schools. And it wasn't at all that not a single person said anything about the academics or the education side of things at all. That wasn't the reason. No one cared about that. The reason was tons of poor families in America are now dependent on the public schools for their free or reduced lunches.
Yeah.
So the problem was that, like, now it's not even just that you're sending your kid to school to babysit them or for them to learn something. Now you're sending your kid to school so they can actually eat while you're trying to work your probably 2 jobs or whatever as a single parent. So schools are morphing into this, something they weren't ever really intended to be. Now there are more sort of social welfare, family services type of institutions that is really interesting to me. That shift is kind of becoming more and more explicit. But that could be a reason why you don't see a whole lot of curiosity about some of these more radical schooling approaches, even something like Montessori, because you push a little bit too far in changing what or how schools operate. You actually take away from some of these other sort of less talked about reasons for the schools to exist, right?
Sure.
You know, especially now in the context going forward, and you're seeing this with colleges now. It's becoming increasingly less clear to people what they're actually doing at schools or campuses. Like, if we can do all this stuff online and we can learn all this stuff online,
right?
What is the point of this? So all these questions are floating around, and my conspiracy theory, this is just my speculation now, is that some of these smart people who are institutional, right, like the people who run the teachers unions, the people who work for the, you know, the nonprofits that really control a lot of education policy in America in terms of like lobbying groups and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, all that. I speculate that they are trying to pivot the sort of PR of schooling more to this social welfare, like, oh no, this is all about, you know, making sure your family is supported, right? Because they may be vulnerable to criticism from the education thing going forward now, because, oh, look, we can just learn on YouTube. What are we paying you for?
Yeah.
Well, oh, now I'm a social worker, so now you have to keep paying me because now I'm feeding your kids and watching your kids for you while you're working your 3 jobs. So anyway, that's just my opinion. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I think it's a possibility that's sort of morphing politically into something else that may actually impede change. You know, that's what institutions want to do, right? They want to impede change as much as they can.
Right. Makes absolute sense. I mean, there's so many other reasons why change is difficult. I mean, just the salaries of the teachers alone and all this kind of stuff. I mean, if you want to break up, you know, what do you call it? Like the way you have individual hours and individual subjects being taught at individual hours, and, you know, the teacher has a specific training and he teaches either math or she teaches French or whatever. You know, if you want to break that up in any way, I mean, that's just hard on its face, because all these people have a very specific job and they only get paid when they teach their subject. And so somebody like Brian, who just has a school and basically kind of teaches everything as somebody needs him to or whatever. I mean, there's so many reasons why that's hard to do. But that's interesting. Your observation is interesting. I've definitely heard some of that in the American news, as you, I think, know from my Facebook feed. I sometimes need a break, but I tend to kind of watch American national and foreign policy kind of news stuff. And
I liked how you asked me what Karen means the other day or something. It's just like this.
I've heard the expression, and
this term that's just evolved in the past year or so. It's now just like taken off, right? And
right.
I was thinking the other day about how sad it must be if there are any baby girls in the past couple of years who were named Karen, because they're going to grow up with all this baggage.
Oh yeah, that's true.
But it is a very interesting concept. It's really cool that we have a short little word to describe a very specific type of person and a very specific type of behavior that we want to change. But it is unfortunate that the word is actually a person's name who, you know.
Yeah, these things are out of control. just happen, I guess. Okay, so you were in Japan. You visited the school for a short time, I assume, and you just kind of got inspired and read up on it.
I got inspired enough to just look into it and stuff.
Yeah.
And what I thought, I actually was initially skeptical of it.
I mean, you spent one day there, or you spent more?
Not skeptical of their school. In reading the Sudbury model, I was a little skeptical of, like, you know, just on paper, I'm like, oh, this sounds like it's kind of training kids to be like politicians or something, you know, which was not something I was interested in doing.
Yeah.
But then, you know, after, I guess, doing more research, I eventually got back to the States, and I wanted to at least give it a shot. And I was able to visit more Sudbury schools at that point, you know, full of people actually spoke my language. So it was a little easier to see what the actual results were or whatever, you know, and that just totally wasn't the case at all. Like it wasn't like a training ground for it wasn't like a giant, I was kind of envisioning maybe like, you know, you try to envision the plus sides and go with the inspiration, but I also wanted to be like, okay, well, what are the potential downsides of this? And so my downside, or my worst case scenario that I had in my mind was that this is just going to turn kids into these sort of like lawyers or politicians or something. And I'm like, oh my God, that doesn't sound like something I want to do at all. But then when I visited the actual schools, I went to Fairhaven down in Maryland, which is a fairly old one that's been around since the early 90s, I think. Beautiful campus. And then I went to Philly Free School and the Jersey Shore Free School up here. And in every case, what I found were kids who were confident in speaking to me as some random adult guy with a beard who just walked into their school, which I was not like that when I was a kid. And a lot of the other people that I knew who went to public school were very reserved in a sense, like almost like shy, like they were intimidated by adults.
Intimidated, either you make fun of them or you walk away and you're scared or whatever.
Right. And so that these kids were totally confident walking right up to me and asking me what I was doing there, or like why I wanted to visit or whatever,
That's
and
so cool.
they struck me as just intelligent, and the fact that they were seemingly walking around and just doing a whole lot of nothing was intriguing to me. But the schools have tons of stuff that's going on, and the little kids are constantly playing and stuff. But oftentimes and this obviously you experienced at my school, and so did I, is that oftentimes, especially the older kids, they just want to, they're just extremely curious. They want to talk about you. They want to learn about your life. They want all the personal details of like the things that you do in your life and all the mistakes you've made and things like that. And, it's very obvious that that's where a lot of learning happens. It's just like meeting people and getting to know, like, almost like sorting yourself, almost like, what kind of person am I? How do I relate? I'm more laid back than this guy, but that she's really like, motivated, and I like that. And just being able to like kind of orient yourself is really important. And that's just really limited if you're in a school where you are whatever, randomly assigned to classes, or you're just like assigned by someone other than you, which classes you're going to be in or which students you'll be in there with most of the time. So they kind of cut a lot of that off. And that also segregates the kids by ages, which leads me into the other thing that is pretty revolutionary about Sudbury, is that it's age mixed. So there's no segregation of the ages at all. And this has tons of learning and social opportunities for the kids, because oftentimes the teenagers, especially the teenage girls, really clearly want to mentor younger kids, and they like being around the younger kids. And it's very clear to me, having done this for 5 years now, that the little kids really seek out that mentorship from people who are more relatable than their parents, because they're much younger, like teenagers. But they're also like adult enough to be able to take care of and assist little kids with whatever, like, can you open my juice box for me? Can you take me to the playground? Things like that. And so little kids love that, because the teens aren't as judgmental as parents can be in many ways. But that said, the teens that, in my experience that I have seen, are quite good at setting boundaries with little kids, and perhaps better than adults, because oftentimes, at least for American adults, I know Americans have weird conceptions of childhood and parenthood and all that stuff, but oftentimes I think adults can be a little hesitant to assert boundaries with kids, because they don't want to be seen as being overbearing or mean or hurt the kids' feelings, or so you'll find adults will play with kids even if they clearly don't want to, and they just want to like sit down and take a nap or something, but they'll feel bad about not playing a game or something. And this ultimately, I don't think helps the younger kids at all, right? Because if you're just fooling them into thinking that you're actually interested, well then maybe they'll have a good time, but you're also kind of showing them that it's okay for one of us. It's okay for this to not be equal, basically, right? It's okay for me to sacrifice while you're having fun. And I think, I don't know, I'm not like hard and fast about that, but I just think it can send some bad social signals, or maybe just immature social signals, that like, because you are messaging at that point. If the kid catches on that, like, okay, Mom doesn't really want to do this with me right now, but she's doing it anyway. I think kids kind of just take for granted that maybe me as the kid, maybe I'm just more important than everybody else, right? So I'm entitled, right? Just stuff
Possible.
like that.
I tend to look at it just very simply from a point of view of honesty, and I tend to look at being as authentic as possible towards a child. First of all, I find it fascinating because it's so unusual for me. Like, if I get a chance to actually be that older person who expresses how I actually feel to a younger child, for instance, I'm tired now, or I'm just whatever, like having to say no, having to say like, look, I have limits and that kind of thing. Like, it's really interesting on the one hand, just to experience that, just because I'm not used to it and I'm not used to experiencing as a kid. But I also feel like it's extremely respectful towards the child, and I just feel like any opportunity you get as a person the child looks up to actually express truth to a child is the right thing to do. Very simply, it's just respectful towards the child, not to basically pretend and lie and kind of go along. And obviously, to me, this is all gray area, and there's always, every situation is different and stuff. And you can also express to the child that you're tired, but you can do it anyway or whatever. But like, I think what often goes wrong in that scenario is that the adult fools him or herself and thinks the child's not going to notice. And I think that usually doesn't work all that well.
Yeah. And I think that's what happened for me as a kid as well. Like, I think I was able to pick up on a lot of stuff like that, and it really rubbed me the wrong way. I think kids are way more perceptive than we give them credit for, especially with stuff like that, like reading our emotions and stuff like that.
And the attention and stuff. Absolutely. I think,
So, but anyway, my experience with the teenagers is that they don't have as much of a hang up with stuff like that, and they will assert boundaries honestly, and sometimes bluntly with the young kids, not in a mean way, but in a way that's like, no, I don't want to keep playing the ball thing. I don't want to keep throwing the ball with you because you keep hitting me in the face or whatever, like stuff like that I as an adult would feel that I had to handle more tactfully or something, or maybe I'd just put up with it for a couple minutes and then try to do something else. They don't really have that, which is good.
That's interesting,
So the age mixing is a huge part of what makes it very special. That, as far as I'm aware, you don't really get with any other model. Certainly no other sort of model in which the kids are in control of that whole thing, right? The kids at Sudbury School they have complete freedom with their relationships and stuff, so that they can hang out with whoever they want. And there have been times where sometimes the teens do want some space from some of the younger kids and stuff, and that presents a very interesting challenge for the younger kids too, which isn't like a boundary of like, hey, I didn't like it when you did this, but just a boundary of like, oh, hey, I just don't really feel like taking you to the playground right now. We've done that every day, sort of thing.
Sure.
And that's a really valuable lesson to learn. It's like sometimes, you have to. No one wants to hang out with you, and you have to be on your own. You have to make the best of that. And I think it's great that kids as young as 4 or 5 or 6 can start, being sort of incentivized in that way to develop their own fun, right? Just like
how do you deal with the child who's having trouble with this? Because I firmly believe that this is all great and great experiences, and as I said, it's like it's a form of respect towards the child, to actually trust the child, as they often say in the Sudbury environment. Learn to trust your child and things like that. But obviously, every child's at a different place, has different experiences. Somebody might just get triggered, by something because they were left alone as a 3-year-old in the back of the car or whatever. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. How do you have you had these experiences, and how do you deal with it? Like, if you have like a 6-year-old who just can't handle that situation, like, being told off by somebody in a not a mean way, as you said, but just kind of somebody doesn't feel like doing that right now. Like, have you had these kind of things, or is it just not?
Yeah, a handful of times. Yeah, we've had little kids just get really upset about it, which is sad to see. But fundamentally, we just have to be honest with them and say like, hey, I'm here to help if you want to talk about it or whatever. But we can't force this other person to do something that she doesn't want to do. You wouldn't like it if we force you to hang out with somebody, or when you didn't want to, and it doesn't stop the pain all at once, but I think just reinforcing those messages helps. And eventually, I mean, my general impression with the younger students, whenever they do kind of reach a breaking point and they do have like a meltdown or whatever, they start crying, is that oftentimes, at home, this kind of behavior ensures that they will get attention and probably ensures that they will get what they want, right? You know, if they're making a big fuss. And, they learn really quickly at Sudbury that it doesn't work like that, which isn't to say we're super inflexible, but, fundamentally, if you start crying because you don't want to do your cleanup job, like we're not going to have a whole lot of sympathy for you because we're all doing our cleanup jobs. Depending on how young the student is, I might say, or maybe a teenager might say, hey, I'll help you with your job or something. But oftentimes the crying stops abruptly after a little while, right? We'll go over, we'll acknowledge them, we'll say, we'll make sure that they feel heard and seen and everything like that. But we're not here to just jump in and offer you all these solutions because that's your job. So, but I found that most of the time, the crying stops and they sort of quickly just find something to do or just go back to what they were doing before. Or sometimes they might just need to chill with their tablet or something for a little while to get over it. Yeah.
But, I feel like at some point we might as well give a really, really short rundown of what Sudbury schools actually are. I mean, you mentioned before that you were worried that it was all about, producing politicians and people who have no idea what Sudbury are going to wonder why the hell did you think that? And I assume the reason why you thought that is because of the whole democratic thing, the whole, all the committees and all that kind of stuff. So maybe you can get into this.
Right. And part of that misconception that I had, that I had met other people who had that sort of misconception as well. Part of it is because the original Sudbury Valley School, who sort of came up with this model and set all the terminology for it, really. Used really, and they did this on purpose. They were trying to model the school after their sort of New England town meeting, which is a style of government. It literally is, the way local government works in New England in America, where oftentimes they don't even have elected mayors or anything like that. They just have their town meeting or town council or whatever. So they were trying to run with this, and they also Daniel Greenberg, one of the founders of Sudbury, also has very much enamored with the mythology of America's sort of creation and the founding fathers and all that stuff. So a lot of his writings,
reading his book,
a lot of his writings are centered around that. So their school uses a lot of language that does seem quite legalistic and kind of intimidating at first. The school meeting is fine, but that they have corporations, which by that they just mean clubs, essentially groups of kids who want to do a certain activity, right? They have all these titles. At our school we just call it a speaker, the person who's just kind of like managing school meeting. But they have like an ombudsman, they have like a school meeting president, all these like very legalistic like corporate names.
It's kind of old fashioned. It sounds kind of old fashioned, yeah.
Yeah, it is old-fashioned, but also like very formal, right?
Yeah.
So I think that leads to that sort of misconception. But I and other staff members at different schools, particularly younger people on the younger side, tend to be kind of drifting away from this and renaming some of our things more friendly-sounding things. Like the dispute resolution part of the school in Sudbury is referred to as the Judiciary Committee, which just sounds horrendous.
Yeah, it does sort of.
Which is why every school actually just calls it JC, right? They just choose to shorten it. And oftentimes the students themselves don't even know what JC stands for because we never.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. No, I had that experience too, to a certain degree. It's like, oh my God. Okay. First of all, way more rules than any other schools. Like, oh, okay, I thought this was a free school. That's one of the weird things that hit me when it was new. And the language kind of wasn't all that inviting. Judicial committee sounds somehow authoritarian, threatening, even though it's absolutely not that. Yeah, right. It's interesting. Like those words can definitely have an effect. I can relate.
Totally.
Yeah.
So, those conceptions just weren't validated by my actual experience and how the school, like the culture of the particular schools. I've actually never visited the original one, so I don't. Maybe that does have a more legalistic culture of farming politicians or whatever. But the schools I have seen,
who knows?
The schools I have seen have tended to have fairly laid back cultures that are very open to expression and very welcoming and not stultifying in that sort of way that the language would lead you to believe. So yes, it is a democratic school in which the kids are involved with all the major decisions. Although I have found I've had to point out at open house events with the public on a handful of occasions that I think people don't really know what to think of what a democratic school is. So they have this conception of like, oh, everything has to be voted on. Like you can't do anything unless the group agrees, right? Which is totally not true.
Like you can't walk out the door, kind of thing, or what?
Or even like, oh, we're gonna now it's time to play with the art materials because all of us just voted, right? It's like no, the only things we vote on are like the rules, how to spend the school's money, things like that. In terms of how you can spend your personal day. Is largely up to you as long as you're following the rules, almost all of which are pretty common sense. The only time rules become perhaps stifling, in my experience in a Sudbury school, is when is really around things that are like procedural, like how do I figure out what my cleanup job is? How do I like try to get my cleanup job changed? Things like that are more like, I guess, more difficult to understand because most of the rules we have prohibiting things are generally things that kids agree with anyway. Like let's not break the law or set things on fire or whatever. Most of the rules are pretty common sense, and not a whole lot is really prohibited that most kids would want to be doing anyway, or B isn't something that is directly beneficial to the school, at least in the abstract, like having it be clean, right? Like where it's like, okay, maybe the majority of kids would prefer to just never clean anything and save the work. But in a democratic atmosphere, we can all come together and be rational and be like, okay, yeah, it's probably better for the school as, our ability to get more kids and stuff if we're clean versus dirty, and that will take some work. So there's not a whole lot in the rule book that any particular kid is going to really have any problem with, except and when they do, that is when we have some of the most vigorous debates at school meeting, like, oh, I think the way we do JC is really corrupt or biased or whatever, so let's just start changing that. Or cleanup time has been revamped numerous times, things like that. How we deal with mugs at the school and how are they going to be cleaned and who's going to clean them and what happens when they're left all over the place and no one wants to clean them, and a lot of things that sound really pedantic and just not fun actually, and that can be true. However, the process by which we arrive at solutions to those problems, which are real problems, they are everyday things that could easily translate to your household or your family or whatever. The process of getting there is actually educational and beneficial. Like it involves negotiating with people. It involves creativity. You got to propose solutions that appeal to more than just you. So what that requires empathy, right? You have to actually foresee what other people are going to agree with or likely to agree with. Then you have to have some degree of assertiveness, right? You have to, and for some kids who are shyer, they have social anxiety, this can be the hardest part about being a Sudbury student, is actually realizing that no one is going to, you can ask for help and, I'll certainly help you advocate for something if you really want that. But generally speaking, if you are shy, this is a good school for you because it's going to put you in a situation where you want to come out of your shell. It's going to encourage you to come out of your shell because you have to voice your opinion and vote and make your you don't have to vote, but you could make your opinions known and stuff like that. And certainly if you are written up for something, or if you write someone up for something, that requires social interaction as well. You have to go in and testify one way or the other or whatever. So there's a whole lot of really valuable stuff here that's sort of baked into the system. It has nothing to do with the stuff that Dan Greenberg actually spends his time writing about. But nonetheless, the system he set up is really, really beneficial. It's very, very intelligently designed for interesting reasons, that encourages the learning and the honing of skills that really just doesn't occur in most schools at all, despite the fact that these are actually the most valuable skills in our society, right? Like the people who are the most conventionally successful are actually the people who are best at these skills that I just listed. But despite that, you don't really get a negotiation class in high school, or even like a social cooperation class or anything like that. I would shudder to think what that would even look like in a public school context.
Yeah.
And it certainly wouldn't be. Certainly wouldn't give you, maybe unless you joined debate club or something like that. But in my experience, only a very, very tiny fraction of kids ever do something like that. So it's not part of the curriculum anyway. So it would be purely something that you did for fun. But these skills are tremendously important. But I found it difficult to market the school in this way because it's hard to know how to refer to these things. I mean, I can list them out, but oftentimes in terms of like structuring an ad or something, in English, we have a term soft skills that describes these and kind of refers to them, but that as a marketing term doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't sound good. Like send your kids to the school so they can be soft, right?
The word, well, okay, yeah. No, the word that popped up in my mind just a few seconds ago was empowerment. And it was also kind of the link I wanted to make with the child who's having trouble at the beginning, and what you were describing a while back. I just wanted to point out that, it's like, on the one hand, you described that, it's kind of like a tough love, learning experience for a 5-6-year-old if that child really is not used to that at all, having to clean, for instance. And I think it's an important piece to not only see that, okay, this is a duty and, you just kind of have to do it. We're here to help you a bit, but you still have to do it if you want to be part of the community. It's like, that's one message, but then comes the experience of actually having a voice. And I think those two things, it's important to me that they come together. That's what's unique, because normally we always have duties. We always have somebody telling you what to do in every school environment and everywhere. There's always stuff that somebody tells you got to do. The big difference is that it's actually kind of a democratic community that came to decide that this is what you have to do. Plus, you get to actually have a voice in that. I just imagine that's really important. Like, if obviously the child's not going to understand that the first day, but after a while sitting in, having some subject that the child really cares about, and then realizing for the first time, I get to actually voice my opinion. I actually could be part of it changing something. I mean, that kind of thing to me is just mind-blowing. I mean, compared to what school is to anybody else, that's a huge, huge difference. And to me, that has a lot to do with empowerment. I mean, that is such a different experience than anything you can be taught. Like anything that you can sit in a classroom and have a class, even a debate class or something, at least it's interactive and stuff, but it's still fake. It has nothing to do with my life. It's just, choose topic A, choose topic B, let's have a game. And you can do that, but I've never been a huge fan of debates, but it's certainly a good experience for some good skills. But the experience of having something that you actually care about and being able to debate that and try to convince somebody and try to find reasons, and then you can repeat it again and again and again. You can practice this skill. You can try to convince people. That's
something that actually changes your world. It actually has an impact on your experience, right?
Exactly.
Like the school could be different if your thing passes, right?
Yeah, and
then it just doesn't involve you; it involves everybody.
To me, in my imagination, this is like a stepping stone or a kickboard or whatever you call it, to get to really kick your creativity like on a social level into gear. Like when you start to connect things that you don't like about the situation with the experience of having a voice and being able to change something. As soon as you understand that this is a system that I actually have a voice in, you start becoming potentially very motivated to
Oh,
think
yeah.
about other realities, to think about how things could be that are not now that way. And to me, that's just huge, because at a school, there's always what we call in German a Deckel drauf. It's like you put a cover over you. It's like you're covered, you know, it's like you can't expand, you can't grow out of it. It's like there's always this outside pressure and limitations right from the get-go. It's not your role to change this. You don't have a voice here, you know.
Interesting concept.
And to me, like taking that away and actually having this chaos out there, it's like there's this anarchy out there. There's this incredible amount of possibility. As soon as somebody doesn't tell you you cannot change this, as soon as you can change this, it turns from this little tiny shell to this absolute huge universe of possibilities. I just, you know, I may be exaggerating here a bit, but to me, that is a huge shift. And if you go through like 8 or 9 or 10 years of school that way, compared to 8 or 9 or 10 years of a school where you have nothing to say about changing the system, I think that's a huge change in how the brain works. Like, you know, just
I think so too.
And creativity and thinking about not accepting everything the way it is, but thinking, oh, okay, so how, you know, if it's not great, why are we doing it this way? Like let's do it differently. I mean,
the public schools definitely
to get to that kind of a place in my life. It's because I just accepted things, as opposed to you. I noticed a lot about things in school, but I also had a very strong tendency to obedience and to accepting authority and to wanting to be the good kid and do things the way I was expected. So I really had to free myself from that. It took quite a long time to kind of get to the other side. And so I just, thinking about this stuff just excites me. I just feel like, wow, like the potential is enormous, you know?
I think it really achieves the actual stated goals of the education system that people will talk about. In a way that the actual education system does not, right? The actual education system was more or less explicitly designed to achieve the opposite of those things, right? They were, you know, in America anyway, you know, that you find the quotes of these guys from the 19th century saying how, we don't want a system that creates a bunch of poets and artists, philosophers or whatever. We want people who can be clerks and factory workers and stuff like that. We want to shrink their world. We want to box them in. We want to teach them just as much as they need to know and not, you know, worry about anything else besides that. Mm-hmm. And obviously that gives you a society that is, you know, hesitant to change, you know, fears change, skeptical of change, society that just wants people to go along with whatever the status quo is. And Sudbury, I think, very much does train people in the opposite way, right? How do we broaden the horizons? How do we work together to solve problems? Mm-hmm. You know, I think about that famous Spider-Man line about like, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think the same can be said with freedom instead of power, right? Like they're two sides of the same coin. So you can't have freedom without responsibility, because freedom implies taking responsibility for yourself. And that's sort of how I deal with the whole thing with Sudbury, because, you know, there is a lot of talk about like, oh, he broke this or that rule, or I'm going to write him up and stuff like that. Because you have so much buy-in from the kids, and the kids do actually take ownership of the school as a concept and the rules that they pass, you do find that the kids are way more vigilant about rule breakers than the adults are, at least in my experience, certainly the case for me at my school, because of that. However, all of that comes with the fact that they actually are given a tremendous amount of freedom, and they realize that they have to be responsible with it. There have been circumstances where I've had to remind the kids or new kids, like, hey, this is actually a very fragile thing here, what we have. You know, especially in our situation where we're renting from this other nonprofit and stuff like that, and they are very conventional and we are very not conventional. So we don't want to bring about any negative attention to ourselves that's going to make these people seem like, oh, these people are weird, what's happening? I've had to remind the kids of that, and they've really risen up to that. They understand it. You know, you just be honest with them and say, hey, you know, this is what we're up against, and our society doesn't know about Sudbury, and they're mostly probably very skeptical of it. So we have to show them, we have to step up, be responsible, and show them that this actually is what we say it is, and it is a great place, a safe place for kids. So that has been pretty successful in my experience in getting them to realize that. And sort of teaching them about the general social context of their school among adults. Like, this is how most adults do not understand us at all, right? So like, we have to teach them that to some extent. But I've also found myself preferring sometimes, especially when I'm not talking to parents and I'm in more of like I don't tend to sell the school, but when I'm in less of a salesman type of mentality, when I'm talking to people like you or just other casual people, I'll describe the school as basically like a sort of co-op or clubhouse for kids that they can actually take ownership in. There is actually no other organization that I'm aware of in the country or in the world where the kids actually, like, legally in our bylaws, school meeting controls the corporation. So these kids are actually enrolling in the school, but they are actually becoming stakeholders in a literal community, a literal corporation that exists. And that gives them, opportunities to affect real change, like you were saying, but also gives them responsibility of almost like becoming partners in a business. We talk about finances at the school. We talk about, hey, yeah, we're having an event. Please come out and volunteer and talk to people who come and stuff like that. And some of the kids really like that, and they do that. Most of my events, if not all of my events at this point, kids volunteer. My students volunteer, come out and hang out with me and talk to people, essentially. And they like doing that. Not all of them, but some of them. And that's a really unique experience. Like, unless you have a family business or something and you've been working in that as a kid, there generally aren't a whole lot of opportunities for kids to join something real as a partner, and not just like, hey, yeah, my uncle has a restaurant, I'm going to go wash dishes for a summer or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of it too, that I think is way more meaningful to the kids than it is to the adults. The adults don't get that. They don't have any frame of reference for that. Like, I can say that to them, but that's not going to resonate with the adults. And it might not resonate with the kids either if they haven't experienced it, but the kids who have experienced it, it really does resonate with them, and they get that. And I think that it's actually the most important reason why kids, almost universally, the kids who visit my school or enroll in my school love it, is for that reason. Not because of me. It's not even because of the woods, the nice campus that we're in. It's because it gives them something that they have authentic control and power in. Even if we get visitors who don't end up enrolling, almost in all cases, it's because of the parents making that decision and not the kids, right? The kids almost always.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, I you probably don't even know this, but I had a really long, well, maybe I mentioned it back then, about 2 years ago, I think that was. I had a really long talk with the grandmother of one of your students, who was really insecure about the whole thing, and it was a really interesting talk. Obviously, I don't remember that many details, but we must have been there for like a half an hour or so while the kid was waiting because she picked him up. But anyway, I just took that as an example. I haven't had a lot of these talks, and I thought it was very interesting. Just all the various fears, which I'm sure you've heard a million times. All these questions of, whether if they play games all day, or the whole thing about the freedom to do whatever. It's just really freaky to a lot of people, and you go through all these scenarios of what can go wrong, and I thought that was very, very interesting. I think there's a lot of things that,
especially to the grandparents, usually. Although many of them warm up to it. We have one grandma now who's become the main transporter of the child, and she's definitely like warmed up to it quite a bit. I do remember that grandma you're talking about, though. That was interesting. Sometimes this happens, though, but she was not at all involved in the decision of her grandson enrolling, but she kind of became a sort of babysitter or whatever. She just ended up being the person who picked him up and ended up seeing more of the school than actually the kid's dad did, who actually enrolled him. So there are interesting situations like that happen sometimes, where it's like the person I'm interacting with as like whoever's coming to the school to pick up or drop off the child is actually not the person who has come to any of my events or ever met me or whatever. Yeah. And so it's almost like, oh, I just convinced this family and they enrolled their kid, but now there's a different family member here I have to convince all over again, sort of thing. Not that
Okay.
they really
Okay.
come up to me for that reason, but they will. I spoke with that grandma on a couple
Yeah.
occasions too, and
Yeah.
there's a certain degree which I have to be comfortable letting go, and because really when you're talking about something emotional like that, you as the other person don't actually have any control or power in that.
Oh yeah.
There's no magic words I can say to her
Yes.
to because it's
Totally.
emotional. It's coming from fear, and
Totally.
I don't mean to downplay that. You should be concerned about your kids and your grandkids and stuff. But ultimately, whether or not you are open-minded is up to you, right? And it is
I'm
up
pretty
to
sure. I'm pretty sure one of the things I like to point out, I probably pointed out there too, was kind of a lack of choice. I kind of like to go there because it's like, if that is the actual real situation, then it's good to think everything through. You need to think, you need to feel through your emotions, all that stuff. But in the end, it can be quite simple if there's no other options. And I felt like that was actually true for a lot of the kids I was talking to at that school, at your school, was basically just damn happy to be out of the other situation, having gone through various problems with the school system, including drugs, pharmaceuticals, including switching schools, including all sorts of diagnoses and things like that.
yeah.
And so that's obviously not a good thing, but at the same time, when it's about, does your child go to this school or that school, if you've already been to 3 or 4 and the parents don't like the idea of a kid taking drugs for the next 5 to 10 years, and here's a school that actually this kid likes to go to, it's
Mm-hmm.
like it gets fairly simple in a way. It's like you can
It does, yeah.
still think about all the, oh my god, what happens if the kid only plays games for 3 years on the computer. You can think about that. You can think about, maybe, is that good or bad, or what can you do about it? Is there any incentives? Is there anything, whatever. But the actual decision whether to send you to school here or not, if it's possible financially and all that stuff, it can be a pretty simple thing in a way. I'm pretty sure I mentioned that too, just based on the story she was telling me. I'm like, well, it sounds like, what else are you going to do?
Right.
Obviously that's not what you want to hear, but it seems like, at least in that situation, it seemed like that was the case for a few of your students when they came there.
Sometimes we are the last resort because we are the most iffy to parents. They've never heard of Sudbury and they've never heard of my school or anything like
Right.
that. And I would actually say the majority of parents, and this was something that really surprised, going into all this, I was like so ready with all the studies and the data and the articles printed out and book recommendations and all this stuff like that. And parents they don't care about any of that. They don't have the time or the inclination. And
Sure.
the majority of the parents that have actually enrolled and, the majority of them are happy, obviously. They didn't really study up a whole lot. I mean, maybe they read Free to Learn by Peter Gray, which is the book I really try to tell everybody to read.
Yeah.
But it fundamentally just comes down to, oh yeah, my kid is really happy again. It's just like when they were younger. They're more creative. They're excited. I don't have to drag them out of bed in the morning. I don't have to force them to do homework at night. I don't have to be the bad guy anymore.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, a lot of it comes down to that. And it's not about my persuasiveness or, the availability of data online or anything like that. It's just the parents being just enough open-minded and just trusting of their kid enough to give it a shot. And
give it a shot, right? Because it takes
Yeah.
a few weeks, I'm sure, until they even see that, at least a few weeks, until they can really be convinced of the change, right? I mean, yeah.
And what the Sudbury sort of dogma is to tell people to like give it a year. For for some parents that's a lot, but there's always, I would say, a year to adapt is not necessary, except for teenagers who have had extraordinarily bad experiences in their previous schools, who are really just like in a shell, or they're very kind of like shell shocked, for lack of a better word. I have seen that, but even then, you definitely see. You definitely see progress in the first month of being in Sudbury. Like when they get that, like, the adults don't have agendas, we're not going to come over to you and start like making you talk or making you do things. Everyone else, you're around people who are having fun. There's not this sort of air of repression around you. And they do start coming out of their shell and stuff. The younger kids, like, it might take a week or so. and then they just, you know,
Yeah, I mean,
start loving
I've
it.
heard of a kid actually here in Switzerland who, like, I don't know, 1 or 2 days visiting Sudbury School. It was like totally obvious, you know. I mean, the kid loved it, and
Yeah,
the
sometimes it's
parents
like that.
noticed it, and you know, this kid was probably pretty young. You know, he's like maybe 8.
Yeah, the younger kids are really plastic and adaptable and stuff like that. The teenagers, you know, their brains are really maturing, and that's when we start to slow down our adaptability a little bit, because then we are like getting more of the ability to focus and concentrate and stuff. So I think the ability to adapt to new situations does slow down for them. And then obviously for adults, it's even slower. But I think with that comes the ability to really laser focus on stuff that like little kids clearly can't do. Which also what makes talking to teenagers very fun for me, because you do start to be able to like get into like in-depth conversations with them about abstract topics and stuff like that, which is kind of my forte, which becomes pretty fun. But they generally don't have the sort of magical exuberance that the younger kids tend to have, especially if they haven't gone to a school before. I have a couple students now who have never been to a school before mine, and those kids are very interesting, because they're not coming with any baggage generally, and they're sort of just adapting to the system where they are empowered and stuff, and they've never done anything like except that. And so it'll be very interesting to me as we all grow older and stuff, for me to kind of see how their lives unfold and stuff like that.
Very
I just
interesting.
feel like they're so advantaged compared to even someone like me, who, I've had a pretty lucky life in many ways, but I definitely suffered consequences from being in the situation that I was in the schools and stuff, and the general kind of repressive vibe that I had to adapt to as a kid. To seeing the fact that these kids won't have to deal with it, won't have to overcome it, like endure all that and then overcome it afterwards, like I had to. Like I did several years of therapy after I got out of college and stuff like that, and I feel like I've been largely successful in sort of undoing a lot of that damage that was done, but I still had to do that, and it's still those are sacrifices that
absolutely.
some of these kids
that's
will
one
not
of
have
my
to worry about.
That's one of my main premises in all of this. The resources that can be saved are enormous, and the potential for society are remarkable when you think of all the individuals that have to go through therapies of various sorts to kind of undo or free themselves of certain things. And obviously school is not the only topic here, but it's just the one that I happen to kind of more or less focus on. I mean, there's definitely a cross section with parenting and any child rearing, any kind of situations in general, but school is just so damn repetitive, and it's a system that's democratically, in a democratic society like Switzerland, it's democratically basically you could change it, and the structure's made by society, so it's like something that better not destroy kids' minds. It's like, if it's something that you pay for taxes and it's a societal institution, that's a place where I feel like, okay, well, at least there we can take science seriously, and there's a lot of science now which is showing that we should do things differently, and so that's just a good place to kind of think about maybe changing some things, and I think it does have a huge amount of power because of how many hours we sit in school, and the training, the conditioning aspect of it, and the uniformity of it all, and so it's like, if you can.
I have a question for you though. I'm curious on that topic. Which do you think is more changeable or more feasible to change, the schooling education world or the parenting world? Which do you think is, if I were to be an activist and I were to choose to focus in either or, I guess I already have chosen one, but like, what do you think is more practical for someone who is interested in pushing the culture in these sort of spheres?
That is I've never asked that question this way, and it's very hard to answer. I mean, my general answer would be a cop-out and just say that it doesn't really matter. It all has to happen. And, because I look at that, I think of the same question in terms of, do I want to focus on the ideal. I'm basically starting a school in the way that I think would be the right way to do it with some other people maybe that think similarly. Or should I be trying to politically change the school system? I mean, that's also these kind of questions. And I just come to the point where it's like, okay, everybody needs to decide, where's my strong point? What am I excited about? What's the topic that I feel passionate about? And it just happens to be more school for me.
Yeah.
And so
Perhaps
that's where I go.
Yeah.
But I don't really have a general answer. I feel like, I guess my feeling is that the parenting, at least in my society, the parenting is changing way faster than the school system. I feel like the parenting, at least when you're in Zurich, the main biggest city of Switzerland, and you see the young people with the children in the city. Again, it's a city thing. It's very different when you go outside and you go into the countryside and stuff. But I really feel like the feeling towards parenting and towards their children is changing way faster because of social media and movies and culture and all this kind of stuff than the school, because the school has all, as we've talked about a bit before, has all these disincentivization of change things going on.
Yeah, it's institutionalized.
It's institutionalized. There's there's the payrolls connected and all this kind of stuff. The politics and blah, blah, blah. And so I feel like it's just, to me, quite important to push hard.
Yeah.
I'm really happy that there are a lot of people doing that. There's quite a movement, I feel like, in the German speaking world. That's all I know. I don't know what's going on in the US. I don't know what's going on in France and etc. But in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, there is really, you don't have to look very long and far to see that there's a lot of movements going on. There's a lot of people organizing. There's a lot of school projects, both completely free and private, but also like public, state-funded schools, individual schools that manage to somehow get, the right amount of people in the right positions to really do something radically different. So it's great, but it's still obviously a total minority. And
right.
And again, I just get to, where am I passionate, or where do I feel like I want to go? And I think that's the most important question for any activist to ask. And I've long learned, for me at least, that the focus on what I consider to be the most important thing objectively, generally, doesn't mean I'm going to be most effective if I go there. I've made this mistake a lot in the past, where I felt like, okay, this is really important. Like, for instance, climate change, environment. Therefore, that's what I want to get into. And I've come to the conclusion that it's way more important to find the right interface. Whereas the interface between what's sensible and important, but also what am I personally actually drawn to, because that's where you're going to be effective,
Yeah, it's one of the things you learn as an adult, I guess, is that each topic, like you mentioned climate change or whatever, I think that's important. Something that is meaningful to me. Other stuff I've done, like animal welfare, stuff like that. And you find that in all these little pockets of society that you can enter into or, delve into, that they each have their own kind of milieu that may or may not be something that is on a more superficial sort of personal level compatible with you. So I think that is a really good insight. I could, just because the topic is meaningful to you doesn't mean that the practice of engaging with those people and in that community is going to be something that is the best for you.
Exactly. And I keep pointing this out too, in terms of, the benefits of free schools, like Sudbury schools, is exactly that experience. We should be having that experience early and as often as possible.
Yeah.
To delve into various topics and subjects and what do you call it? I can't think of the word. Just things to be engaged in, or jobs or professions, and actually have the chance to try it out. Actually, the practice, as you say, of doing that. What does it feel like? What's a daily grind? What's the boring stuff? What's behind the scenes? To actually experience that was, again, this friction in my adult life that seems mostly unnecessary if I imagine myself veering out into my interests earlier on and having the chance to make more of these experiences earlier on, and so it's something. It took me a long time to get to the place I'm now, and obviously I don't expect it to be the end all total realization, but anyway.
That said, I do think talking strategy is important, and I think some of the other stuff that's happened in America besides COVID have been interesting. in that way, because there's a lot of talk of strategy in terms of activists with regard to the George Floyd uprisings and stuff like that. And I think even in our world for education, people who care about changing things in the sphere of schooling or homeschooling or whatever, talking strategy is still important. And I think we do need to, we can't ignore, we can't focus on schooling and ignore parenting. We can't ignore parenting, focus on school or, whatever. We can't ignore one and try to work on the other. That said, I'm not a parent, so there's not a whole lot of credibility and there's not a whole lot of work I can personally do in that sphere besides simply share ideas with people, share resources with parents, and do kind of more passive things like that, but while also keeping my ear on it and paying attention to it. And hopefully cooperating with people who are more in that space.
Well, listen, we're already up to almost 2 hours. I usually talk for like 2 hours with these things. It seems to take that long to kind of get to know a person and cover all the various interesting topics out there.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's at least another 2 hours to talk about. There's a few things that popped in my mind, and I just I'm kind of thinking about it right now. One of them is that it occurred to me listening to you that Switzerland is actually probably, I tend to think, from the political institutional setup that we have here, the most similar to how a Sudbury school works. Mm-hmm. I think I tend to think of Switzerland as being the most democratic society in the world. I don't know for sure if that's true or not, but we have democracy on more different levels and more integrated in society than I'm used to from anywhere else I'm aware of. And so all these committees and all these associations, like this is how the Swiss culture works. They're all in these intersectional associations, like everybody's member of 2 or 3 associations, and it can be sports or it can be various interests or whatever. And so that's all democratic, and you have all these meetings and you have to do the finance together. And I mean, that all works just like, your committee, or what is it called? The main committee thing?
School meeting.
The school meeting, yeah. So it's like I feel like a Swiss who's not totally isolated traditionally will have a lot of experiences actually as an adult, not in school, but as an adult, where that's actually very similar. And it just occurred to me that what's his name? Greenberg's point of I have a quote here: the educational system in our country today is the most un-American institution we have in our midst. And I think that's way more true for the Swiss even than the Americans. I think he's referring to an ideal of the American Constitution, of some of the founding fathers, and that's all great. But I think actually in reality, I think the Swiss system is probably closer to how the way the society actually works as an adult is actually closer, which to me would make Sudbury schools even more, attractive. Like it seems like I should be selling it even more here.
Yeah, it sounds
under that aspect. It's like, hey, we really are a democratic society. We want people to be used to debating stuff, coming to consensus together, coming to agreements. How do you say? Keep thinking of German words. Getting involved, basically. And so I think the Sudbury School would be the only real preparation for that. I mean, it seems kind of obvious. Anyway, that was the one thought I had. And the other thing I just like to mention, I've already mentioned it in a different interview with a lady who started a school which is not democratic, but is otherwise quite close in terms of the freedom. Like in terms of, for instance, having all the different kids of different ages interact together. That was one of the more touching things I've seen so far in these different schools that I like to visit now. Was just like the way that school worked is they had basically 3 sections, like 3 different rooms or buildings for different age groups. And everybody was kind of allowed to go anywhere except if the people who actually belonged there didn't want them there. So it was like, you had like the teenagers room, and usually if they went there, they were alone. They kind of, went there if they wanted to be alone. But then the teenagers would often go down to like the kind of kindergarten, elementary school age group or something and just hang out. So they'd just be like hanging out on the sofa, and you'd have like, a 14-year-old boy and his friend, and then you'd have like an 8-year-old hanging out, and they'd be, I don't know, just talking, or like,
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
it looked like a
pleasant to be
family.
around the younger kids. It's actually they add energy and sort
They
of
add their
happiness.
energy. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I thought that was just a really beautiful thing where, got me thinking of my own experience and just like, oh my God, the kind of stuff that you miss when you're not even aware of that's possible. And I had a similar experience in the only JC I attended, which was at your school. I think this was on Friday. Is that right? Last day I was there? I'm not quite sure. You guys did the judicial committee, or JC, I guess as you call it. And just seeing that in practice, I thought also was really inspiring. It was touching and inspiring, just kind of proving to me, or making it experiential, to see how what we normally consider kids to be kind of debating and judging and figuring out consequences for misbehavior for other kids that were a little bit younger in this case. And just seeing how that works, and seeing how they're all trying to be fair, and they're not making fun of each other or putting each other down. They're not like just saying, oh, you're shit because you did something wrong, or, whatever.
Right.
Like, just, I don't know. I just thought it's the kind of thing you really have to see. I just feel like you have to experience this before you can even imagine
it's
the
totally
value
true.
of it, and that it actually can work, and kind of what children are capable of. I think that's one of the big stumbling blocks when you talk to adults. It's just, you've never seen this happen before, perhaps, and you can't really imagine what it means, and you also can't really imagine. You tend to underestimate. I think people tend to underestimate children, just in general. Like,
or
the
effects that this system will have on your child, certainly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that again. I thought that was a wonderful thing. Yeah.
Yeah, for those reasons, I tremendously respect all the parents who end up enrolling their kids into Sudbury schools, especially the ones that are really just kind of like, all right, we'll try it out. This sounds okay. I have no idea what you're talking about, or I have no idea how to visualize this, but it sounds like something my kid would like. So let's let them try it. And it shows a lot of trust, right? And also like sort of allegiance in your kid's experience, right? Because the hangups that parents typically have are things that are way more abstract, and like they're worrying about like 20 years into the future, like how will they get into college, and it's like a 5-year-old they have, and like that stuff is more selfish, I think. Even though it's about the kids, I think it's actually more about what the parents are feeling, and how the parents might feel like they would be judged, or even just sort of not letting the fear. Maybe selfish is too harsh, but maybe just letting the fear blind them to the potential upsides for their kids, the upsides that they themselves won't ever, they won't get to be in JC or whatever school meeting, but they don't foresee the joy that they will feel from seeing the positive effects on their kid, and how it will kind of percolate up to their family life and improve all that stuff. And that's the stuff that I can't even really I can tell you that stuff will happen, but why would you trust me? I'm just the guy that's trying to like sell you on this idea. It really does take trust to really go with it. And so I have a tremendous amount of respect for them, because they're trusting me and the school model and stuff without a tremendous amount of cultural reinforcement or real reasons to do so, right? So it's like kind of putting their necks out a little bit.
They have not had the experience themselves. They really don't have a lot to work on. Yeah, that's very true. I do tend to feel like other children from your school are maybe very important ambassadors for that, as you were saying, when they go along as volunteers and stuff. I would imagine that might have an effect, seeing 2 children or 3 children of various ages. As you were saying at the beginning, I've had that experience now multiple times, and it seems obvious to me that is connected to the school system, that these children tend to be more confident, basically, and have like this expectation of respect. Like they don't have a problem interacting with adults because they assume that they will and should be treated as respected respectable individuals.
And maybe that would actually have a stronger effect on non-American children, because as far as I'm aware, American children are already more likely to be more outspoken and sort of confident in that way, even the ones that go to public school. But if you're talking about German kids or Japanese kids or whatever, or French kids, I don't know, actually that aspect may be even more beneficial.
Very possible. I would say Switzerland for sure. I tend to think of the Swiss as a pretty obedient culture. Obviously, terrible generalization, cliche, and all that kind of stuff. And the society's changing also here quite rapidly. But I'd say traditionally it's a pretty obedient culture, and men, I guess men and women tend to be kind of insecure when they get into adulthood. That's just my cliche generalized version of the Swiss culture compared to Australians or Americans, for instance.
Right.
I find that quite striking, and I've heard a lot of other people confirm that. So yeah, I think you're right. I think that would have an effect. Yeah, that's interesting. So I don't know. Is there anything else you want to get off your chest? Otherwise, I feel like it's probably time to wrap it up. I mean, obviously, I can't promise you a lot of publicity from this show. Nobody in the US is listening to this. It might change someday, but your school is called the South Jersey Sudbury School?
Yep.
That's right? Yeah. As you said, a beautiful, beautiful park area, beautiful nature area, really nice place to be. I don't know. Is there anything else you think of?
I don't think so. This has been really enjoyable call. It's been great to hear your voice again. If you want to have a follow-up call before the end of the summer, I definitely have the time.
Okay.
Not doing anything. All of my festivals and things I usually do in the summer have been canceled. So I'm here if you want to do it again.
Good to know. Very good to know. Yeah. I've seen things. You're into like